History remembers the sound of the explosion, but it rarely notices the silence of the fuse. If you ask most people when the global order collapsed, paving the way for the Second World War, they will point you to New York City in October 1929. They will tell you about panic on Wall Street, stockbrokers jumping from windows, and the Great Depression radiating outward from America. They would be wrong. The crash of 1929 was certainly a disaster, a massive contraction of wealth that left bruises on the global psyche, but it was not the killing blow. The world, fragile as it was, actually stabilized in 1930. The markets calmed. There was a brief, desperate hope that the worst was over. The real end of the world didn't begin in a skyscraper in Manhattan. It began in a quiet, paneled boardroom in Vienna on May 11th, 1931. It started with a balance sheet that didn't add up. It started with a bank called Credit Anstalt. When this single institution failed, it didn't just wipe out savings accounts, it snapped the spine of the global financial system, forced the abandonment of the gold standard, and radicalized the German middle class to a point of no return. We often think of the rise of the Nazi Party as a political phenomenon, driven by ideology and hate. But if you look at the ledger, you see a different story. The road to Stalingrad, to Normandy, and to Auschwitz began with a liquidity crisis in Austria. This is the story of how a bad loan became a world war. To understand how a single bank could hold the detonator for a global conflict, we have to look at the strange, mutilated map of Europe after World War I. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, once a massive economic zone stretching across Central Europe, had been carved up by the Treaty of Versailles and the Treaty of Saint-Germain. What was left was the Republic of Austria, a tiny nation with a massive head and a shrunken body. Vienna was an imperial capital built to administer an empire of 50 million people, now governing a country of only 6 million. It was a city of ghosts and bureaucrats, filled with grand palaces and banks that had lost their purpose. In this vacuum, one institution stood as the titan of Austrian finance, Credit Anstalt. This wasn't just a bank, it was the entire Austrian economy wrapped in a pinstripe suit. By 1931, through a series of government-forced mergers to save weaker banks, Credit Anstalt controlled nearly 70% of Austria's trade and industry. It held over 50% of all bank deposits in the country. The bank was owned by the Rothschild family, a symbol of old-world financial stability. If you lived in Vienna, you didn't just bank with Credit Anstalt. You worked for a company they owned. You bought goods from their subsidiaries, and your pension was tied to their solvency. The assumption was absolute. Credit Anstalt cannot fail because if it fails, Austria ceases to exist. This fragility was masked by the illusion of the golden age of the late 1920s. American capital was flooding into Europe, rebuilding German industry and keeping the lights on in Vienna. But this money was what economists call hot money. It was short-term loans, callable at a moment's notice, being used to finance long-term projects. Imagine taking out a payday loan to build a factory. As long as the lender keeps rolling the loan over, you are fine. But if the lender gets spooked and asks for their cash back on Tuesday and your money is cemented into a factory wall, you are bankrupt. The system keeping this delicate flow of money moving was the gold standard. In the interwar years, the gold standard was treated with religious reverence. It was the golden fetters that bound nations together. Every currency had a fixed value in gold. This meant governments couldn't just print money to solve their problems, because for every paper note, they needed gold in the vault to back it. It was designed to prevent inflation and enforce discipline. In reality, it created a doomsday machine. If a country lost confidence, investors would pull their money out, converting it to gold and shipping it abroad. The central bank would see its gold reserves drain away, forcing them to raise interest rates to attract the gold back. Raising rates in a depression is like treating a bleeding patient with leeches. It sucks the remaining life out of the economy. The stage was set. The floor was soaked in gasoline. All it needed was a spark. And that spark came from a decision that, at the time, seemed entirely rational, even clever. This brings us to the fatal mistake. In March 1931, the politicians in Berlin and Vienna made a calculation. The German and Austrian economies were both struggling. Tariffs and trade barriers were strangling them. So, the German foreign minister, Julius Curtius, and his Austrian counterpart proposed a Zollunion, or a customs union. They would abolish tariffs between the two German-speaking nations to boost trade. Economically, it was a brilliant move. It would lower prices, increase efficiency, and help both nations recover. Politically, it was a death wish. To the French, this looked exactly like Anschluss, the forbidden unification of Germany and Austria. France, still traumatized by World War I, viewed any coordination between Berlin and Vienna as a prelude to a new invasion. The French reaction was swift, brutal, and financial. They decided to weaponize the bond market. France began aggressively selling off short-term Austrian and German debts. They pulled their capital out of Vienna to punish the Austrians for the customs union proposal. They intended to twist Austria's arm to force them to beg for mercy and abandon the union. They didn't realize they were pulling the keystone out of the entire global arch. The pressure mounted instantly. Credit Anstalt was already weak, burdened by the bad debts of other banks the government had forced it to absorb. When French capital started fleeing, the bank's balance sheet began to hemorrhage. On May 11, 1931, Credit Anstalt announced a loss of 140 million shillings. In today's terms, the number seems small, but in 1931 Vienna, it was the apocalypse. The loss wiped out most of the bank's equity. The run began immediately. It wasn't just grandmothers lining up to withdraw their savings. It was foreign banks, hedge funds, and governments frantically wiring money out of Austria. The Austrian government tried to stop the bleeding. They guaranteed the bank's liabilities, effectively putting the entire nation's credit on the line to save the bank. But remember the golden fetters. To pay out these panicked depositors, the Austrian central bank had to print money. To print money, they needed gold. As they printed shillings to replace the fleeing foreign capital, the ratio of gold to paper collapsed. Austria was bleeding to death. This is where the tragedy turns mechanical. In a modern economy, the central bank would just act as a lender of last resort, printing fiat currency to flood the system and calm the panic. But under the gold standard, Austria couldn't do that without breaking the rules of the global order. They appealed to the Bank of England and the Bank of France for a loan of gold to stabilize the shilling. The Bank of England tried to help, but the sum was too small. The French, blinded by political vengeance, delayed. They demanded Austria politically renounce the customs union before they would send a single bar of gold. By the time the diplomats stopped arguing, it was too late. Austria suspended gold payments. The shilling crashed. The contagion didn't respect borders. Modern banking is a web of interdependencies. German banks had lent heavily to Austria. When Austria froze assets, German banks suddenly had holes in their own balance sheets. Panic leaped from Vienna to Berlin in a matter of weeks. The Detonated Bank, one of Germany's largest, faced a run and collapsed in July 1931. The German government, terrified of a return to the hyperinflation of 1923, refused to print money. Instead, Chancellor Heinrich Brüning implemented brutal austerity. He raised taxes and cut wages while the banking system disintegrated. The result was economic carnage on a scale the modern world struggles to comprehend. As the German banking sector imploded, credit vanished. Factories that were profitable one day closed the next because they couldn't get a loan to buy raw materials. Unemployment in Germany rocketed upward, not steadily but vertically. It went from manageable levels to 6 million unemployed practically overnight. The middle class, which had just barely recovered from the wiping out of their savings in the 1920s, was destroyed for the second time in a decade. This is the pivot point of history. In the elections prior to this crash, the Nazi Party was a noisy but manageable fringe element. They were losing momentum as the economy had stabilized in the late 20s. But the banking collapse of 1931 changed the psychological landscape of Germany. The average German looked at the establishment, the moderate politicians, the international bankers, the Treaty of Versailles enforcers, and saw only incompetence and malice. They saw a system that prioritized the rules of gold over the lives of their children. When the global financial system abandoned Germany, Germany abandoned the system. The collapse forced the United Kingdom to abandon the gold standard in September 1931, a shock that shattered the remaining trust in international trade. Nations turned inward. They erected massive tariff walls, trying to protect their own dying industries. Global trade fell by 2/3. This was the death of the liberal economic order. In this wreckage, the Nazi message suddenly resonated. Hitler didn't just promise hate, he promised autarky. He argued that Germany could never be safe as long as its economy depended on the whims of French bankers or American stock markets. He argued that Germany needed to be self-sufficient, immune to the contagion of international finance. And since Germany lacked the natural resources to be self-sufficient within its own borders, the economic logic dictated that it must expand. The quest for Lebensraum, or living space, was partially an economic strategy born from the trauma of the 1931 credit freeze. If you can't trade for oil and wheat because the banking system is broken, you have to conquer the land that has the oil and wheat. The democratic center in Germany collapsed along with the banks. By 1932, the Nazis were the largest party in the Reichstag. The banking crisis had done what beer hall speeches never could. It validated the extremist view that the current system was a suicide pact. The failure of Credit Anstalt proved to the German people that the international rules were rigged against them. When money dies, politics gets violent. We look back at this cascade, Austria, then Germany, then Britain, then the world, and we see the terrifying speed of financial contagion. It took less than 6 months to turn a recession into the Great Depression. The mechanisms of a debt are invisible threads that bind us all, and when they snap, they whip with enough force to decapitate empires. The Paulo fatal mistake on the customs union and the French retaliation reveals the danger of using finance as a weapon of war. France wanted to hurt Austria diplomatically. They ended up destroying the economic containment field that was keeping Hitler out of power. There is a haunting modernity to this story. We live in an era of sovereign debt crises, of banking contagions, and of hot money flowing into emerging markets. We see nations today using the SWIFT banking system and sanctions as geopolitical clubs, freezing assets to force political outcomes. We see a globalized economy that is efficient but brittle, optimized for profit but lacking in redundancy. We assume that because we have central banks that can print money, we are immune to the chaos of 1931. But the psychology of panic hasn't changed. The architecture of leverage hasn't changed. The collapse of credit Anstalt teaches us that there is no such thing as a technical banking failure. Money is effectively a system of trust, and trust is the foundation of peace. When the banks closed their doors in Vienna, the social contract was breached. The people realized that their leaders had lost control of the machinery of survival. The tragedy is that the Second World War wasn't inevitable. It wasn't written in the stars. It was engineered, inadvertently, by serious men in suits who thought they were just balancing books and scoring diplomatic points. They believed the gold standard was more important than social stability. They believed that economic pain would teach political lessons. Instead, it taught the world that when the economy fails, the monsters waiting in the wings don't just step forward. They are welcomed in with open arms. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And if you listen closely to the creaking of the sovereign debt markets today, to the arguments over tariffs and trade wars, you might hear the faint, discordant echo of Vienna in 1931. If you want to see where the rhyme goes next, you know what to do.